Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready. Let's get ready to rumble. The great debates. We're here at the True Life Podcast. We got the one and only Mr. Wizard, Benjamin C. George, coming straight out of Colorado. Paula Powell, bringing it tough from Maui over here. And you got George Monty, True Life Podcast. We should have Kevin Holt joining us soon. We are jumping into the wonderful world of language. To everybody who's listening right now, let me ask you, do you think the language you speak is superior to somebody else's? Are you more intelligent because you can use the canon that is the English language? Can you describe a situation and make it seem better than someone who doesn't speak well? That's what we're talking about.
Well, I think
Paul,
we're.
yeah, we've been talking about it.
I
Go
was going to
ahead.
say I think we're already in the weeds there because you said is it superior,
Okay. How should we
right?
define this better? What do you mean?
Well, I mean that's going to be I think that's kind of an ego-driven response, right?
It is. Okay, let me try to
So
change it.
yeah.
How about this? Is Sapir-Whorf theory true or false, or can we discuss it? And just so everybody knows, is the semantic structure of a language, does it shape or limit the ways a speaker forms conceptions of the world? And let's start with the idea of Schadenfreude, since we were already speaking about this. In German, Schadenfreude is a word that illustrates the concept you are a little bit happy that someone you know is having a tough time, and you're a little bit happy. It's that feeling you get. You feel a little better because someone else is feeling bad. I don't know about that particular expression or type of language in English, and that would be a example of Sapir-Whorf theory, saying this language allows the individual or speaker to form better concepts about the world. How does that sound?
All right.
Okay. Okay. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think there's going to be trade-offs in that.
Okay.
You're going to have Schadenfreude, which is going to be a very contextually driven kind of a definition for people, and it paints a very specific picture based upon the interpretation of that word, whereas the offset of that is me being able to articulate my feelings towards the given situation about somebody I know, and you know why I feel that way. That's kind of the ability for the English language to kind of create perspectives and be able to look at these different concepts from multiple different angles. So in the sense of your question, I would say that there is something to be said about being able to articulate oneself in such a way to build those ideas. Um, but at the same time, you know, as learning Spanish, there's a lot of things that don't translate directly from Spanish, but they actually do flavor a conversation to a point where I have a deeper understanding of what somebody says because I understood the concept and where it comes from in the language. But translating that, it does lose something. So I think it's going to probably come down to the individual, the speaker.
I wonder, like, so I guess we should try to figure out how to break down it better. Like, could you say that German society, let's say English society, is the English world, the English speaking world, a better place to live than the world of people that like do the click language? Like, which one would you rather? Which one would you rather be in? And is it because of the language?
Me personally, I'm going to say that it's not because of the language. I think the language flavors the culture, right? And the culture definitely imparts itself into the language. But better or worse is going to be very subjective. It's going to come to, it's going to come down to interpretation a lot of the times, education. Uh, so when you start to attach the better judgment, I think that's going to be just subjective. Uh, but personally, I find great pleasure in being able to potentially articulate myself well. And I've found that when you can do that, despite the language, barrier, like especially learning Spanish, it was one of those things where it's like I was a third grader for, the first 2.5 years I was learning Spanish. I was pointing and asking and, using the same words over and over again. So I think it's going to be very contextually driven and very subjective to kind of the end user, if you will.
We got Dan Hawk. Dan showed up. He's you guys have probably seen him on the podcast before. He is the head scientist for the First Nations Planet of Defense. I may have messed that part up right there. But Dan, we've been talking about languages, and do certain languages make cultures better? Are some languages, is language perhaps one reason why some cultures tend to be more wealthy and more culturally robust than other cultures? So I know you speak multiple languages, Dan. What's your take on the idea of language and how it influences society?
Well, I believe that language is a good influencer of society. I know that in the Native American language, in the Iroquois language, in which we talk about before, that our hymnals at our Episcopal Church are in Mohawk, even though I'm Oneida. The idea there is that just recently, I heard a word. I can't remember what it was now off the top of my head, but there's no translation for it. I think it had to do with some atrocity that happened, and there was no word for that in the Native American language for that kind of abuse, that kind of atrocity. Is something we did not know in ancient times. We did not know those kinds of words. So there was no translation for it, for that kind of atrocity that I'm thinking about. But I can't remember the specific word, but yeah, the translation is lost. And I know Native Americans were taken advantage of during treaty negotiations and those kinds of things where, there was although maybe not intentional, maybe some were intentional, but the translation of, how far things were, as an example, to this tree, or 10 days canoe ride, or those kinds of things, where exactly did 10 days canoe ride end? So those kinds of communications can be vulnerable to people, when they are taken advantage of, when there's that kind of language barrier. So I think it could be both, George, on the wealth side that you're talking about, because they have great knowledge and understanding and wisdom. Where on the other hand, if you have people that are disproportionate, or and developing countries as an example, and maybe in Amazonia as an example, that they are taken advantage of because maybe they are not. I'm not saying they're dumb or stupid or anything like that. It's just that the language there, our understanding, for example, our understanding of, years ago, that you could not buy land, right? It was crazy. You can't buy land, you can't own it. But the point being is, and I made a reference to this just recently on one of our LinkedIn posts, that it was referenced to the moon, going to the moon. How are we going to go there, and people are going to, companies are going to buy land on the moon? I'm going like, we've been through this. We've been through this kind of colonization before, and what they do, George, is called exclusion zones. It's called safety zones. And exclusion zones has to do with rocket engine dust blast. The blast of the engines and the ejecta. You can only be a certain distance away. So when you land there and your rocket engine is there, you basically own a great distance of the lunar surface, because nobody else can come land by you. So you're, by exclusion zones, you're basically in ownership position, and it's really crazy to think that way. But that's like, for Native Americans, we bought this land. See this fence? You can't come within this fence, and if you do, we're going to shoot you, right? But on the moon now, the exclusion zone is a virtual understanding of what that engine ejecta would be to damage another piece of property on the lunar surface. So it's really crazy to think that way. But yeah, that's my answer. Yeah.
That brought up a memory for me, and I'm going to butcher this story, and I'm not even sure of the veracity of it. But I did hear a story once upon a time when the missionaries were going down to the Amazonian tribes, and they were trying to describe concepts to them, and they didn't have certain concepts in their culture, or like I forget exactly what it was, but it was, like age was one of them, I think. And because they didn't measure that, it wasn't a part of their language. So, and then, to Dan's point, it's been abused throughout history, right? It's replete with abuse throughout history, and usually, this kind of gets into what we were talking about before the podcast, but language seems to have some sort of context or in how we wage war, and that's very much in how we deal with those situations, like how the Native Americans were dealt with in this country, and how Native populations have been displaced in other countries, where they didn't even have the concepts that were a part of the Western cultures, or the conquering cultures, or what have you, and so they weren't able to have a meaningful debate about this. Not to mention the fact that people have guns and threatening to kill people if you don't agree and sign right here. There's a lot of extenuating factors to that, but language does seem to have some sort of impetus to push us towards maybe language is how we define our conflict, and then through that definition arrives us at additional conflicts. I mean,
Yeah.
to your point earlier, look at the headlines of today, right? All of the rhetoric of the past, the ancient, or not ancient, but the older terms, Nazis and all these things. Now this resurgent um, kind of zeitgeist that's just everywhere, and you can't escape it. And so we painted this past before, and now we're reutilizing this language to basically wage war.
I see. I think all of this backs up the idea, and this is difficult for me to say because I don't really want to believe this. However, it seems to me if you have a complicated language that can come up with concepts that other cultures don't have, I think you're outthinking them. Like if you have a linguistic pathway for battle that, like if you have a concept that someone else doesn't have, that's a different weapon you have in your arsenal that they don't have. If I've been trained in MMA and you haven't, you could still beat me, but I have a lot more techniques at my disposal to try and trick you, to try and deceive you. And we can argue that that's what language is. I'm not saying it's right, and I'm not saying I condone it, but it seems to me, Paul and I were talking a while back, I can't remember the last time a culture with a small alphabet beat a culture with a big alphabet. And I think that comes down to having your words as weapons. It comes down, if you can conceptualize strategies, whether it's through, by hook or by crook, like you're going to take advantage of someone that doesn't have it. An adult can take advantage of a child through language.
The legal system.
Look at the way lawyers take advantage of people today. They have what they call legalese. How many people can read legalese? And that is a continuation, I think, of Sapir-Whorf theory. And it's not something that a whole lot of people talk about. And I think if we did talk about it, it's something that would drive people to become better at language.
So George, are you basing this theory on war? Like people that have a more complex or complicated language are better at war? I mean, is that like, I don't know if that's any sort of way to be basing, either intelligence for the people or, advancement of a people. I mean, I think that maybe the culture that avoids war is the smarter culture. The cultures that don't practice war are the smarter cultures. That, and many of them have more simple languages. I mean, this whole idea about like simple language and more complex language, I don't know, it's kind of a slippery slope. There are smart people, really smart people from all types of backgrounds and cultures, regardless of what language they speak. I thought it was interesting too that you pointed out like an African language that uses clicks. Like a Central African, nomadic tribe, by the way, versus would you rather be living there or in Germany? How about a language that may not be so as complicated as Germanic languages in Latin, and ask yourself, would you rather be living in France or Germany? It's kind of a better question.
Well, I'm glad you brought up those points. It's not that I'm basing it on war. It's that I'm basing it on the evolution. And I think evolution is, whether it's evolution of culture or evolution of education, it seems to me that the people in power dictate the rules. And so while I'm not basing it on war, I think that I don't think might makes right, but it seems to me, at least in today's world, the people that have the most weapons and the most power and the most ability to coerce another group of people set the rules. And if you set the rules, you make the policy. You are walking evolution. You have the scientists. If we look back in history, and we look at the largest powers, those were the people that were setting culture. They were the people that were setting the policy for the future. And it seems to me that you could probably look back in history and see, I don't know, maybe we can do this now. If we look back at the people that ruled the world over the last 1,000 years, did each one of those countries have the best language of their times? I mean, the Romans were.
What do you mean best?
I'm sorry.
What do you mean by
most?
I think you're talking about an evolution of priorities.
Well, how do you explain priorities? What device would you use to explain priorities? Would you use language?
I mean, like what you're talking about.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah.
Here, let me just, I'm gonna jump in on the
Please.
art of war. The best the art of war goes like the very first evolution priority we're talking about is that the best war is the war not fought. So that tells you that if you don't need to fight the war, don't do it, because there are real no winners in war. So I think it's an evolution priority. Yes.
It's interesting you bring that up because, I would say there's a dichotomy throughout history. There's always been a sect of any given culture that's coming to my mind that is more of a pacifist kind of angle. And then there is the non-pacifist angle, the warring angle.
Yeah. I would say the person that has the most to lose is the person who doesn't want to fight the most, so if you look at if we talk about the people who don't want war, like we should say, are those people prepared to fight? Because the people that don't want to go to war are the people that are probably guaranteed to lose the war. If I'm going to fight 100 people, I definitely don't want to fight that. But if I'm going to fight one-on-one, I might go out of my way to not fight it, but I'm not afraid to fight it. So I think there's a difference between that. But yeah, please.
Well, I think, just kind of confining this to language alone misses enough of the picture that it's going to continually make this confusing. Because it's not just language, right? We're talking resources, location, we're talking climate, we're talking, calamities, all sorts of different things, which those in themselves impart into culture, into language. But I think they are a large piece of that picture. For instance, like if it was just the language and just that kind of inspired the technology, yada yada yada. Well, gunpowder was invented multiple times across the ancient world, but it was only really the Greeks who utilized it in a wartime situation, and then brought that to the world as a piece of warfare. Whereas over in Asia, it was more of the fireworks, and it was the artificers and things like that were utilizing the black powder.
What about I think that there are a lot of moving parts there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but would you agree today that, or what do you think about today's world? Like, it seems to me the people in the poorest parts of the world are afflicted by many things, but one thing they are afflicted by is a language that could be better.
I don't think it's lack of communication that's keeping them poor.
See, I disagree. I think exactly that. I think it's their inability to communicate incredibly effectively with their language. I think that they're lacking the concepts in their language to fully become who they could be.
I think there's something to that. If you just look at it from like a scientific technological angle, right? if you don't have the concept of a gas powered engine, if you don't have the concept of a piston, if you don't have the concept of these different components that enable that, it's sorcery, right?
Yeah.
And
So
so
what do
things that we, huh?
I mean, you guys suggesting that if they just all learn English, they'll be better off?
No.
Not
No.
necessarily. No, I'm just saying that it is kind of there is a correlation between the exploration of the world, eh, and technological innovation is directly tied to language for sure. Now it's but how far is it tied is it's something I'm not entirely sure about. Maybe we can get there in this conversation, but I don't think that everybody should speak English. I don't think that that's the solution. I think English is kind of it's kind of a interesting language, in terms of its descriptive ability, but it lacks a lot in terms of its emotive ability at some levels. Where you like in Spanish, for instance, it's much more of a emotive type language. Those Latin root languages tend to be, whereas like Germanic and things like that are much more uh, logical and systemic and concept based. And I think that kind of shows up in the culture too. I mean, for instance, everybody knows German engineering, right? So I think there's takeaways here. I think we're kind of beating around it and nobody's getting the right words.
What do
I
you
mean,
think, Paul? You seem to be against it, Paul. What do you think?
I don't know, like, you get someone to run out there and start telling everybody, like, hey, man, just learn a more complicated language and all your problems will be gone.
Well, I don't think it's going to solve all your problems, but
I
the
mean,
ability to come to the table and speak with somebody, that's where conflict resolution begin,
I think
right?
in today's world, countries that are suffering and that are poor, I think everybody in the industrialized Western country is exactly aware of what's happening in those places. I don't think it needs to be discussed. People actually know what's happening. You want to get into salient details of like what's going on in some of those countries that are struggling, is from like a day-to-day perspective of the people, then yeah, language plays a key role there. But I think we all know what's going on in some of those places that are suffering. You got corruption, you got
There's a lot more. Yeah.
a lot more things happening. And I don't think that a change of language. I mean, I think this what we're doing here is just trying to let's boil it down and see who speaks the better language. Or there's a lot of things that go into what makes societies beyond language. And the language is part of it. But I mean, there are a lot of things that shape a people, future, the destination.
I just like I would disagree. I think that the world is made of language, and that you can choose the words you use explain who you are and where you live. The
Yeah, but
words you use
you and me,
explain
they do.
everything. I'm sorry.
Yeah, to you and me, they do because we both speak the English. But I mean, like, try telling that to somebody who speaks like from Papua New Guinea about you're going to use all these extravagant words, and and they're going to look at you like, the hell are you saying?
Can I chime in?
Please.
With like, I don't know.
I think sorry, I didn't go ahead, Paul. I didn't think you were finished.
I'm done. You're good.
I think we're going to get the answer to this question eventually anyway, because I think, how when you watch Star Trek, you've got those universal translators. We're not there yet, but the technology is already kind of there.
Mm-hmm.
The AI, because I used to work in translation, I still do off and on. And when I first started, there wasn't that many tools out there. And now it's so AI driven, and some of it is really good. There's one called DeepL that's really good. And I'm giving away a secret here. I do Chinese translation to English. And most of the time, I just put it into DeepL, paste the results, and edit it a little bit. And it takes me 30 minutes, which would take 2 hours. Mm-hmm. So that's already kind of there. We've already got voice transcription technology. So it's another step from having it translated to then spoken out in another language in somebody else's earpiece. It might take 10 or 15 more years of development before we get there, but we're going to get there eventually, I believe. So we will be able to have better communication. We'll be able to see how much role that plays in diplomacy and international affairs.
I would agree on an overarching scale. We are moving towards more of a universal language, whether that be via translation or just kind of a conglomeration of language happening over time, simply because we're more connected and everybody around the world is now able to communicate. And I think the more and more that we communicate, we eventually push ourselves to that universal communication, because there is a desire to be understood.
Yeah, and technology will make it so that we don't have to go and force people to learn Esperanto. We can all learn the language we grew up learning, and technology will try and do the work for us. That's what I think. And given enough time, yeah.
How does it?
Well,
like,
I remember.
Please.
Oh, I was
ahead,
going to
Dan.
say, I remember the word that does not translate into Iroquois, and that word was inhumanity, and that's the word that didn't translate. So you can see, like, oh my gosh, like, wow, yeah, there's going to be languages that don't have words to express those kinds of things that we would see, that would be completely out of the normal for one group of people, for one linguistic group, as an example, may not have felt those kinds of things, or maybe even positive things. Maybe there's positive things that cannot be described. But yeah, across cultures and cross languages, there are going to be those ideas that just don't mesh up. They're just not right. They're just not going to work. And I mentioned to George, when my grandmother was little, she was blind for a little while, and she was on the buckboard with her dad, and she looked on the pond, and she seen these fairies dancing on the pond, but there was no translation for fairies. So it was the closest translation to that Iroquois language was sky people. So you can imagine fairies to sky people, that there's a great distance between those two, fairies and sky people. But yeah, I think we can get ourselves into trouble when we're not on the same wavelength. And I also believe that there are room for opportunities to learn when we are not on the same wavelength. So we have to look at it both ways.
Yeah,
on that point, the Japanese word for communication is communication. They literally took it from English because it didn't exist.
Well,
so that kind of stuff happens already.
Right. And English is replete with those too. There's a lot of those cognitive words in many languages now, so they do adapt over time as well. But that's why, to Kevin's point, I think we are moving towards, via our technology and our mass communication, we are moving towards some sort of conglomeration of those things.
I often wonder, with so many cultures that have gone, that we didn't understand their language, like how many of their concepts have we lost? Like maybe we have lost some real wisdom and ideas that we can't even think of right now, because we've lost that linguistic pathway.
You don't even have to look to linguistic pathways. I mean, just look at all of the 1900s, 1905, 1910. These people were doing all sorts of work with magnets, electromagnetism, all of these things, and all of these wonderful inventions came about. You can go to any electrical engineer coming out of college these days, and they're unaware of these older inventions, even some of the concepts, even though those concepts influenced what they're taught is how we, utilize this knowledge in the world. So, I think we suffer from amnesia, just at a cultural level, internal to language, let alone external to different languages.
I went back and I've been reading some of like the Homeric verses, or even if you read like Socrates or any of these old classics. Might a better way of language be like a form of poetry? Have you ever read like a poem and you get goosebumps, or you read a poem and all of a sudden you see the thing? Maybe that's the way and there's so many structures with poetry. Like you got onomatopoeia, you have all these structures. Perhaps that's the right way to speak language, because if I say to you, tiger, tiger, burning bright, if I can speak to you in a way that is almost a type of performance, not only am I using my words, but I am performing it out to you the same way a bird might dance for another bird. There's almost a dance there, which is another sort of level on top of language. And then you could thoroughly understand what I mean instead of trying to interpret my words. What do you guys think?
Well, we're going there technologically in a different way. You have
How's
Elon Musk with his Neuralink, right? If all of a sudden I don't have the filter of having to put together my thoughts into English language and I'm just thinking my thoughts and you're perceiving my thoughts, that's kind of that dance, but at a much more intimate and visceral level.
I
So I
how
think-
is that going to work though? I mean, is that Neuralink going to like somehow get some electrons from my brain to understand, or?
Well, I'll go briefly into how it
Okay.
works, but so basically what they're doing is the chip is interpreting the different firing of neurons. And so when we're like looking at an object like an apple, there's a set of neurons that fire in the brain, and they fire in different sequences, and there's specific timing to like an apple. So an apple and an orange might have very similar firings, but there's going to be different timings, or there's going to be different articulations of those firings that are interpreted by the chip in the sense of a frequency, and then that's interpreted by a computer in like they hooked up the chimp to play Pong with its mind.
That's mind blowing to me.
It was
George,
pretty
didn't
wild.
we talked about this on I think one of our episodes where we were saying how with time language went from symbolic to discrete, and now with Neuralink it seems like we have the opportunity to go back to symbols and just communicating in thought forms, like these alien entities we would see in the psychedelic trips seem to communicate with us. So that's fascinating how we're sort of going backwards in a sense and being less specific with the words. And that ties into what Taoist philosophy and a lot of Eastern philosophies say, is that language, when we put a word on things, we're actually losing the essence of the thing, because you're not looking at the object as it is anymore. You're putting labels on everything. And as Dan was saying, you're prone to miscommunicating things if you don't have the correct label, rather than just seeing things as they are. So I don't know if I like what's going to happen with Neuralink, but it's interesting from that point that we could maybe get around some of these barriers.
Yeah, I think the idea of labels is a huge problem. I remember hearing a story about, and maybe it's our language that limits us. I mean, if you think about a baby outside for the first time, and this little bird flies by him, and he just sees this magical beast, but someone's like, "That's a hummingbird." Like, that baby has just lost the ability to imagine a flying little dragon beast. Instead of him coming up with his own definition, we've went ahead and pigeonholed. Here, just take this little simple thing. It's that. Now you've even though it's great for communication, it puts us on the same page, it limits us because now you've put blinders on that specific object. Maybe that seems like what we do with a lot of our languages. That's how we dehumanize people. We label them, or we dehumanize them. We call them an animal, or we give them a number.
It's also incomplete. I remember recently I was at Mount Zion National Park with this stunning view of the canyon. And I'm just looking at this thing, and my friend's going, "Why aren't you impressed? Like, why aren't you saying anything?" And I'm like, what words do you want me to use that is ever going to capture what I'm looking at right here? I could say it's beautiful, but that's not really communicating the essence of what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm.
So we were talking. Go ahead.
I was going to say cameras kind of have an interesting correlation to that as well. There's some images where there's sunsets where you could take a million pictures of it, but you're never going to capture that sunset. It doesn't matter what lens you have, doesn't matter your exposure. And some of them are going to be really pretty, but you're just not going to capture the essence of that, right?
Yeah, it's almost. What do you think about nature as a language? If you look at the way a plant produces flowers at a 45-degree angle to the sun, if you look at the way a bead of condensation falls off a morning glacier and rolls down to the bottom of the hill, only to be sucked up and repeat the process again, can we learn how to communicate better by watching nature?
That's mathematics, right? In essence. Which, some people would argue mathematics is kind of, the universal language, right? Because if I can interpret the 45 degrees and someone else can interpret the 45 degrees, all of a sudden we're talking about the same thing. But at the same time, mathematics, unless you're a string theorist and really get into it, it lacks the descriptive ability to really contain the world and describe the world at a human level.
Yeah. Speaking of, like, so if we were talking about Neuralink, let's change this topic from, what do you guys think, what do you think about this process of genetic engineering, or even the idea of the singularity? Like, is this a natural process?
I was going to let somebody else chime in.
I've heard Joe Rogan speak about this, and he'll say, well, humans are making it, so therefore it's natural. I don't know, but I think maybe resistance is futile at this point. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime. I'm going to try to avoid it, but I think the next generations are going to be part of it.
Well, I mean, in terms of genetics, our genetics are changing all the time. Some of them at different rates than others. Some of them are much more deep-seated and don't seem to change at all, but there's the ability for the environment to necessitate a change. There's things like junk DNA that's getting more research now that's showing that it's not junk at all. When you get into epigenetics, things like that, it's not just the single thing that's happening. It's not the receptor, it's the entire environment around it that's influencing that whole thing. So from a genetic point of view, I think, we are evolving genetically, but to go in and hack it like a CRISPR type technology, right? Like the guy in China who just, I was fixing AIDS, but made the kids more intelligent. Oops, right?
Is that the twin girls story you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That guy got arrested, but he probably got arrested and put into a top secret research facility. People like that typically don't just, disappear off the scene. They get repurposed.
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't heard that story. Can you share that story? I don't know it.
So there's a scientist, they called him a rogue scientist. He was in China, and he decided to use CRISPR to edit the genome of a couple twin girls. And the idea, what he was trying to do was eliminate the ability for them to develop AIDS. That was the purported scientific, perspective. And then, the downstream consequence was that these two girls are now more intelligent at just a natural level than their peers.
Like,
Have you guys seen
more
the show?
intelligent?
Huh?
Sorry.
Thing. So he embedded English.
Yeah, he embedded English, right, George?
I didn't thoroughly hear it, Paul. What did you say? What about English?
Paul was making a good joke.
I said, so he embedded them with English.
Well, it sounds like he embedded them with the ability to speak language better. What? Okay,
Have you guys
go
seen the
ahead.
show Altered Carbon?
I haven't. I've
didn't
read
see
one
it.
of the books, or part of it. But
Check out season 1. I think it's kind of ties on to what we're talking about here, where, as we know, the last 100, 200 years, we've seen growing income inequality. Well, that show is kind of saying it's just going to perpetuate, and those that have the means are going to be making cosmetic babies, are going to be finding a way to live indefinitely, and then have like total control over everything.
I think that, looking at everything in human history, I don't think there's much evidence to suggest anything otherwise.
I think it's already here. I mean, listen to, I caught an episode of Rogan, and he tells you like all the stuff that he takes. Like, that guy's getting HGH, testosterone injected, in NDAA, not NDAA, one of these other substances that lengthen your telomeres. And like, those are just the ones that I know about. I take an HGH supplement. I got to tell you, I feel 10 times better when I take that, and I think it's subjective, but I bet you if I took a panel, it would be concrete. I can feel the difference. I can feel my knee not getting sore. I can wake up feeling better. And, you couple that with, maybe there's some sort of gene editing too in the future with CRISPR, something like that. I think it's already here.
Yeah, look into Ray Kurzweil, the movie Transcendent Man. He takes like 100 pills a day. That guy
looks great, right?
Yeah, he's like almost 80 now. He still looks like he's 60 or in his 50s.
Yeah,
Well, and then there's Dr. Sinclair out of Harvard, who's, you know, he basically, his statement is that we'll be able to reverse aging here soon enough. And that's the NAD that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And he also uses metformin.
Yes.
And so he's taking NAD and metformin at very high doses on a daily basis. And just kind of subjectively watching that guy like 7 years ago to now, he looks younger. So
Yeah, metformin is really cheap too. It's hard to find. Like what used to be really easy to buy nootropics online, but it's become increasingly difficult. You could pick up metformin for like almost nothing. I think it's like, 3 cents a pill or something like that. It could be something that helped the world, really.
What's the HGH you buy, George? What's the name of it?
It's called MK677, and you can get it. It's a SARM. It's a selective androgen receptor metabolic or something like that. But it's SARM, and you can find SARMs online. The best way to look them up is to look at the bodybuilding forums. Those guys are like the ultimate guinea pigs, man.
oh yeah.
And they'll tell you everything that they're doing. But I had an amazing trip last night or 2 nights ago. I took like 8 grams of like a albino penis envy. Like, and dude, there is just like the last few trips that I've had, like I've been really working with the concept of time. And I would say about 3 hours in, like I found myself on this plateau of understanding, this form of clarity that can only come from a mass psilocybin trip or some sort of entheogen probably. And it's so weird how you can see yourself outside of time. I felt as if I existed not only in the present, but simultaneously in the past and in the future. Like the feeling of oneness, I don't think the word well-being is a good enough word to describe the way I felt myself participating in the moment. It's so fascinating to me. And it seems that at high doses, you are beginning to understand the concept of time differently. I don't know why I just wanted to share that with everybody. Thanks for letting me share that. Hey,
go ahead.
I was going to ask you, what is your take as a Native American on the idea of embedding technology inside your body?
Well, I have to go back to the genetics part of it, because right now in Native American speak, right? So we have 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And, according to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in order for you to be Native American, you have to be at least 1/4 blood quantum of that one single tribe that you get to pick from. And you could be, because I know I'm half Oneida, but I've known Native Americans that were more Native than I am, but have not had more than 1/4 blood quantum of any one tribe. But then we're not able to be on the tribal rolls because they did not meet the criteria. So right now there's a big deal about this, George, because if you're Native American, blood quantum is thinning out. So we're not talking about specifically genetics in a way that you guys were talking about, but think about us being a melting pot, right? We're global, right? So we are becoming more and more not ourselves. If you want to say it that way, we are becoming more and more not native because because of that melting pot issue. So then the idea then, George, is I have to carry a card that says I'm Native American. No other race do you have to carry a card that recognizes you as a specific race other than Native American. I can use my card to go across Canada as an example, or I can get an airplane and go to another country because I have this card that says I'm a Native American person. But eventually what's going to happen is through the colonization process is that eventually we're going to have natives that are no longer fitting the criteria of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. You are no longer native anymore. And then we are going to how you say we've lost our culture, we've lost our language, we lost who we are, we lost our identity. This is an area of termination. This is an area of genocide. These are the kinds of speak that we are talking today in Native American languages across our 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. And it's not just us, it's also in Canada. So our First Nations people altogether, we get 1,204 tribal governments across North America, but we're all in the same boat.
Now, Dan, does that mean you're a member of First Nation and you can avoid paying the IRS tax?
Well, actually, United First Nations Planetary Defense arises from the Jay Treaty of 1794. So we're the only business in the United States that is both recognized in Canada and the United States, because our business comes from a treaty, in 1794. But so here, our First Nations people in Canada and our Native American people in the United States, that border between the United States and Canada did not exist for Native American people, and it should and ought not to. And that was, the Article 3 of that Jay Treaty that says you have commerce between our tribal peoples, between all of North America. So in a way, yes, I suppose, because, as an Iroquois, as Oneidas, we were pushed west with the Cherokee, Trail of Tears kind of thing. And we have Oneida in New York, as the Iroquois people there in New York, Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk. And then we have Oneida in Canada because of our westward push, and then Oneida in Wisconsin is where I ended up with my ancestors.
Yeah, I feel like you should get a free pass forever based on what happened historically.
But you would think so, but then you can talk about things like, boarding school. Right now Canada's reeling with, boarding school deaths of our children. My grandmother went to school at Jim Thorpe in Carlisle, as an Indian boarding school. So there's some stories about that, and native kids, and in some cases the stories go like, the only reason why that child of ours died was because of a broken heart. And so, yeah, well, it's getting emotional for me, so I'm gonna set off for a side.
To Dan's point there, and to your question about moving towards a singularity, I think he touched on something that's kind of more at a visceral level, but that's that is kind of moving us towards a singularity as well. We are losing that genetic diversity, and it's all becoming a big giant melting pot. And I think that's the idea of the singularity merging with technology. I think if we tie it into language as well, all of that has to come together, where there is just kind of homogenization of things, of language, of technology, of genetics, and then you would have the ability to have that integration at the high technological level. I personally don't ascribe to the singularity. I don't think we're going in that direction. I think it's very interesting, like Joe Rogan, I think, because we're talked about him, he mentioned, and I think it's Kurzweil actually, that we're kind of just built to build the AI. We're built to build that next generation of intelligence, and that's just kind of the evolutional process of an intelligent creature on a planet, which is an interesting concept too.
It is. I come down on the side of like Team Human. Like I don't think that artificial intelligence is a threat to take over human beings, or I don't think we can download our consciousness into any sort of robot or computer. I think it's a tool, and I think that it can. There's a new app that I have that you can type in whatever you want, and the artificial intelligence will draw the picture for you. But it's just scanning the internet and putting pictures together. And you could argue, well, that's what imagination is, maybe. But I think that it's a tool we use maybe for war, maybe for good, maybe for bad, but it's still a tool. It's not something that's going to take us over unless it's a tool that goes inside of us and is manipulated. I think that that's the false promise of AI, is that once it's inside you, you're going to be better. I think once it's inside you, you're a liability.
There's a couple directions to go there. I did a lot of work on artificial intelligence, and for quite a while I had it in my head that I wanted to create artificial general intelligence, which is kind of what more of what people are talking about when they're talking about AI. is an artificial general intelligence, meaning something that has the ability to reason through something, and it's not just pulling from a collection of data sets like your AI artist. And artificial general intelligence is a much more difficult nut to crack. You know, these AIs like the art thing, it seems very impressive, but the nuts and bolts of it are very simplistic. Artificial general intelligence escapes all of the people researching artificial intelligence to date, despite many great attempts, many great ideas, and billions of dollars in funding. You know, so when you combine that with a Neuralink, now you're saying, oh, we're going to put AI in people's heads, but there still has to be some human, you know, kind of artificer in there. There's still somebody who's kind of pulling those strings, you know, let alone if you allow the ability to transmit into these things, then you have a whole different host of problems because, you know, making them unhackable is not something that we have the ability to do either. You know, the only thing that we've ever made on a grand scale that has yet to be hacked is, you know, like a Bitcoin, massively distributed, decentralized systems. And even then, there's edge cases that can allow it to, you know, come under attack. So this is it's a big topic with a lot of moving pieces. But I mean, ultimately, I think I agree with you. To human is to human, and we're going to continue to human. We're just developing better tools to human.
My friend just sent me an article that I posted in the chat titled "Chinese Company Appoints Its First Humanoid Robot as its CEO." And I wanted to pose a question. Maybe I get Benjamin your thoughts on this because it's something I've thought about for a while. I don't know where I fall on this, but if we can agree that most of the problems of humanity are a result of the twisted incentives, greed, and profit motive and ego, what about the idea of some kind of blockchains, open source AI that actually governs us fairly and non-egoically?
I think the question becomes what's fair.
Yep.
And so my Terra Libre project, I've thought pretty long about this, and what I came to is a distributed blockchain system, but that enables an individual one person, one vote system. So now every single individual in the community is, responsible for their vote, and there's no representatives to these things, but then all of the votes are executed by smart contracts. So that once the vote is the vote, that is the vote. There is no machinations, manipulations, taking advantage of people, behind the scenes type stuff. It's all a very transparent system. And I think that's kind of the balance between those two things, because, if I create the CEO AI, well, it's only as good as whoever programmed it and their intentions and their aspirations. Now you could have a group of people do that, but at the same time, it's very easy to coerce a group of people. They can always think that they're doing it for the greater good. And there's plenty of people who claim the greater good. And, historically speaking, we look at it and say, not so good.
The AI CEO is still a CEO, right? It's still the top-down structure of like, well, that's what the CEO did.
Right. And then you have the other question of accountability, right? Because now who's accountable when the CEO messes up? Do you fire the AI CEO and get another one? Who does the firing? Is it a board of directors monitoring this AI? I mean, the complexities of that, I think, it sounds good on paper, or even interesting on paper, maybe not good. But I think once you get down to the brass tacks and actually how humans interact, how business is done, all of the intricacies and all of the stuff between the human interaction parts of it, I think it leaves a bit to be wanted.
It's almost like an extra layer of protection, because if corporations are already people, and they're protected by the Supreme Court, but maybe a CEO does something so egregious that he can be held responsible. Maybe now you have like the AI CEO, like, yeah, well, nothing happens to that guy, or
right. And by extension, nothing happens to the people who program that, right?
That's a good point. I never thought about that. Maybe. Yeah.
Well, if you have a decentralized voting structure, maybe you could update the code as you go, as one potential workaround.
Right. And then it comes down again, who updates the code, what's their intentions, you know, and this is the same problem we run into with all sorts of representative systems and top-down systems. You know, who's pulling the strings at the end of the day? What's their motivation? Is it altruistic, or you know, do they have ulterior motives? And you know, I think we as humans who've grown up in this world know that everybody seems to have ulterior motives, even if, you know, some of them seem to be benign. I know I do.
Part of being human, I guess. You know, here's back to what Dan was saying. Like, you know, if he can see that it's becoming increasingly harder to say you're Native American, and you're literally losing the blood that runs through your veins, and we also say that the same thing is happening with the singularity. Isn't this idea of the singularity just like a mass die-off of populations?
Well, I mean, it would kind of indicate that, you know, if you merge with technology, eventually the biological system would peter out, right? And
Right.
so, and then what's the point of creating another biological system if I have a robot that lasts 1,000 years? Now that's assuming that you could actually, you know, put consciousness into some sort of, you know, artificial system, which I don't know. There's very interesting evidence about that. You know, there was back in 2012, one of Google's big data centers. All of a sudden, it started moving information around in the ones and zeros, different than its programmed algorithm. Turns out it was a more efficient process. Is that a conscious choice? Is that just an emergent pattern of? Is it due to the underlying structure? Is consciousness an emergent pattern due to the underlying structure? You know, Neuralink kind of is making that assumption, and to a certain degree, they are. You know, there's a chimp playing Pong, right? With
guess
its brain,
also
no less.
I guess it's also kind of impossible for us to know if something else is conscious, because I can only know that I'm conscious. I can't know that
Right.
anyone else is.
Right, and you know, again, that consciousness is just a word that, you know, you won't get a solid definition from anybody,
Yeah.
or a consistent definition rather. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to think about. It seems like so much of these things that we worry about, or that you hear some of the most elite people talk about, are just fantastical ideas that are just pie in the sky.
A lot of them are grifts to get money.
Whoever has the nicest illusion, like we talked about before, it's like the person with the best story and the best illusion gets all the attention and money.
and we're back to language.
Indeed.
Did you hear that, Paul? Are you there, buddy? Man, what do you guys think about legalizing all drugs?
Let's go for it. What we've done so far hasn't worked.
Yeah, I'm all about, you know, extreme personal responsibility. I don't think, you know, people dictating rules and regulations, especially when you look into why certain drugs are illegal, you know, yeah, most of them were grifts for profit, or to oppress a certain people, or, you know, or to, you know, take a certain portion of the populace and make it so that nobody would respect them, or their ideas. And you know, to that point, a lot of our alphabet agencies are, you know, kind of built around the same idea. The FBI was founded to spy on anti-war protesters in World War I, right?
I saw an interesting article. It was in somewhere, and it says CIA takes like 25 tons of cocaine from Colombia so they can destroy it.
Right.
I was
Right.
like, what? They're going to destroy it how? By sending it out to people in the country, or, you know, selling it?
Is that the same CIA that actually created the whole Colombian cocaine trade? Because yeah. Yeah, that Freedom of Information Act has been a pretty enlightening thing for those who followed the exploits, if you want to call them that, of you know, the previous generations.
Have you guys ever filed a FOIA?
Not personally, no.
Me neither. One of us should probably do that for something.
What do you want to learn?
I would like to know. That's a good question. If you could FOIA anything, what would you FOIA? I guess I would try to FOIA the back records of the what was the Branch Davidians. I would like to know more about the cults, like the Branch Davidians, maybe the Oklahoma bombing. I'm sure you probably couldn't get those, but I think that those would be interesting documents to read.
David Koresh.
Yes. What was going on there, man? Remember they went in heavy with all the guns. They went in deep. They just burned those people like that. Is that really necessary?
Yeah, that was. Yeah, I would like to. Those would be interesting. I would also like, Admiral Byrd's Operation High Jump. That would be interesting. When a guy, falls out of a window at the end of his life. There's a lot of people falling out of windows these days, huh?
What was that one? I don't think I've heard that one.
Operation High Jump was a post-World War II operation that took the U.S. Navy with 4,000 some sailors, Marines, I think 1 or 2 aircraft carriers, destroyer, a whole group, and went down to Antarctica, and it was officially classified as like a exploration mission, scientific mission. But it was directly after World War II, and there's a whole bunch of conspiracy stuff about it, which you can find deep dive on the internet for days. So I won't get into that stuff. But
can you see this? This is the diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Now, I don't know how much of this is his actual diary and how much of this is just complete BS. But in this one, it talks about high jump, and it talks about him going down to Antarctica, getting on a plane, and then disappearing into like an area where there is no radar, where they're completely off. He just disappeared. And in this particular book, he says that he met, we're going deep, guys. We're going to go deep right here. But he met with aliens, and these aliens were like, listen, you ain't ready for this yet. You're a good guy. We see why you're down here, but take all your stuff, go home, and don't ever come down here again. This is off limits for you. And the way I heard Operation High Jump was that one of the conspiracy theories behind High Jump was that New Swaziland is a place in Antarctica. And if you look at some of what the Germans were doing as far as research, they were traveling all over the world looking for these artifacts, and they set up this place in New Swaziland. And they say that underneath, like at New Swaziland, there's this giant cavern, and they sailed their submarines down there. And inside that giant cavern, they found like these warm well springs where there was livable land. It was total growth. It was warm. And they moved just a huge number of scientists and people down there, and they still reside down there today. They also say that, according to some different conspiracy theories, that, and there's a bunch of weird stuff that has happened recently with like the guy Krills, the minister for the Eastern Orthodox Church, was down there. John Kerry's been down there. Obama. Like, there's these weird pictures of those guys down there. Like, and why is it that Antarctica is like the only place that people aren't fighting over? Like, we're fighting over the Arctic. We're fighting over every land, every landmass. Our country has troops everywhere. We're constantly fighting for resources. We're trying to terraform Mars, but we don't even want to terraform Antarctica. Like, why don't we terraform that first, man? Like, that has an atmosphere down there. Like, why have everybody decided not to go there? Like, that's odd, right?
There's a lot of odd stuff around Antarctica.
Yeah.
And to what you were talking about, the Nazis in New Schwabenland down there. One of the Nazis' explorations through the Thule Society, right, was to figure out how to get into the inner Earth, how to find Agartha.
Right.
That was their expeditions to Tibet are well recorded. So they searched the world for this, and they believed at an institutional level that this was the reality. So, obviously, unless we sail down to Antarctica, we're probably not going to find out. But you're not even allowed to sail to Antarctica without special permission.
Yeah, I want to go. I think there's a there.
Let's crowdfund the submarine. See what happens.
We're going to find Agartha, folks. Just need to raise $20 million.
I have this theory that like there's a whole set of underground caverns that connect the world. Like if you remember how the in South America there's tunnels that connect like all through the Andes Mountains. There's all these tunnels that connect underneath. There's like a whole intricate set of tunnels that connect large parts of South America. I often wondered if maybe
It's
that
not
wasn't.
just
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's and then you hear stories about like the what was that El Dorado, like the city made of gold. And if you look at some historical texts, you can read about some of the Incas and the Aztecs using these tunneling systems. If you read the Popol, which is like the creation myth of South America, they talk about all these entrances to Inter-Earth where they would go down and they would meet these beings. And it took like 4 days to get down there. And you would pass these giant mushrooms that lit up the caverns. And it's so interesting to me if you start looking at all the different ideas of inner Earth. Like I read this one book. It's called Olaf Johansson is this guy that wrote a book 100 years ago, and he told a story about traveling to Franz Josef Land, which is way up top. And him and his dad ended up just out in the middle of nowhere, and they thought they were going to die, and they were freezing. All of a sudden, the water got warm, and they found themselves like surrounded by this inner sun and alien land. But every one of these different inner Earth stories, they seem to have so many similarities. It's almost like how every biblical book or every book from antiquity tends to have a flood myth. So too do the books about inner Earth tend to have similar things about giants and an inner Earth and an inner sun. And there's got to be more. And how come like if you own land, you're not allowed to dig down? And what's up with all these like how many in America? There's all these sonic booms that always happen. Like, you know how there's booming under below us? Like, there's all these earth where no one knows what it is. That they're building tunnels is what's happening. And all like the mountains the secret mountains we have, they're all underground bases. Like, there's got to be a whole network underground of bases that we don't even know about.
Oh,
is that too crazy?
Oh no. Well, I mean, from FOIA, we do know that they've been building massive underground structures in the United States. But to your inner Earth, there's a lot more to that too, because when you start, and I wish Dan was still here, when you start to learn the indigenous legends of, where they were created from, a lot of them are, this is the third time that we've emerged from the ground. The ant people came and brought us into the ground. There was a cataclysm and they brought us out. And that's North America, South America. It's Papua New Guinea. It's Australia. It's all over the world. So you have to, one has to wonder if all of our ancient texts of antiquity have this concurrent thread, and all of these oral traditions and stories passed down have a concurrent thread. Is that a real thread, or is that just some sort of, artifact of humanity? I would argue that it's a thread that we could probably pull on given the right resources.
Your wish is our command. Dan is back. Dan, have you heard this? Have you heard when we were talking about the ideas of inner Earth? And Benjamin brought up the idea of some folklore about us coming from inner Earth. Were you able to hear any of that?
He might not be back.
Maybe not fully back.
From the Native American point of view, Iroquois, right? So we have our creation story comes from Skyworld. So we come from above. But there are natives, I believe Klamath as an example, they come from inner Earth. They come from and they come from the ground. So we have a dichotomy in Native American people that your creation story is either from the ground or from Skyworld, and we happen to be from Skyworld.
Can you share that? Can you share that with us, Dan? Your creation myth, creation story.
Well, at the Iroquois legends is that there was a floating island above Earth, and at the time Earth did not have any permanent. It didn't have no land. And there was a tree that was uprooted, and for different various reasons, depending on you're talking to. The tree was uprooted, and there was a priestess, if you want to call her priestess. She was, she was pregnant, and she was looking down the uprooted tree, and either she was pushed or she had fallen. And when that had happened, that our birds, our flyers were able to save her and pick her up as before she fell into the ocean. And when they got to the ocean, they needed a place for her to stay. And so some of the animals then tried to go down deep into the ocean to find land. And I believe that there was several attempts by different animals that had actually died because of their attempt to find land. And I believe that was muskrat that was able to go deep enough to grab a little bit of land in his paw and then bring it to the surface. And what he was able to do then was he needed a place to keep it, so he put it on Turtle's back. And when he put it on Turtle's back, then the land grew, and that became Turtle Island. And that's where we are today, is we're in Turtle Island. So that was basically our Sky World story.
Oh, that's awesome. Hey, Paul, are you there? Paul, you told me an interesting story one time about the Hawaiians' ideas of creation. Can you share that? Maybe. Paul, you there, buddy? He must have stepped away for a minute.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting story, Dan.
That's an awesome story, Dan. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Kevin, what do you know what are some of the folklore, and have you learned some of the folklore in Bali?
Not really. No, I'm sort of ignorant, but I do know that they have, I think, one day a month where they sacrifice animals to the god of death.
Whoa.
And they actually usually sacrifice chickens, and they make them fight each other before they do that. So it's sort of spiritual cockfighting.
I wandered
Man.
into a cockfight in Panama. It's pretty spirited.
Oh yeah.
It's big in Hawaii. There's people that have birds and they win. If you have a good bird, you can win probably hundreds of thousands of dollars if he fights and lives
Really?
long enough. Yeah, I see guys. There's guys here that walk
Yeah.
around with tattoos of like that. They have like a big chicken on their leg. And like, what? We got a damn chicken tattoo.
Oh,
Okay,
and the
so
way
how
that
much
they carry him around too. It's just like, yeah, they're on a throne.
Yeah, man. Yeah.
Gold
It's
leash.
amazing.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world we live in if we're willing to step back and see the magic of it every day.
Well, and I think it's such a travesty that, swaths of information are just buried and locked away and not,
Yeah.
Vatican archives, Smithsonian, vaults, all of these, institutions who went around and scooped up mass amounts of text and information. If it didn't fit their narrative, it just got buried. And there's a lot of stuff out there. I found down in New Mexico, my buddy lives down in a place called Silver City, and he took me to some petroglyphs, and they're Egyptian in nature. There's an ankh in these petroglyphs, and you can see where it is actually, it looks like it was probably with higher waters, it was probably a port. And you can see kind of the level around it. There's old fossilized like wooden beams in the rock in some places there. But yeah, Egyptian hieroglyphs in Silver City, New Mexico. And I've heard of, Egyptian hieroglyphs found in caves in the Grand Canyon as well. There's the stuff up in Michigan, I think it was, where they found tablets and all sorts of different, artifacts relating that were most certainly Egyptian. So the story of humanity is one that we're just so lacking of knowledge. That is one thing that bugs me. If I could FOIA the world, that would be my FOIA.
Yeah, the purpose of history seems to be a mystery to me. It seems that history is made up to organize people around a common goal regardless if that goal is good for the individual. And it's usually a goal that is good for a ruling class of people. And they just make up this story that everyone's supposed to believe and fight for.
Well, most people are familiar
Sure.
with winners write history, right?
Well, for Native American people, right? So we didn't really have a written language; it's all oral. So history is seen through the eyes of those who write it, and so our native history is completely just it's devastating to us. We frankly, we have to have Native American scholars go back and rewrite history. So I think that how you vision history is through those history books in school. But who wrote those books? And so, um, you know, you know, from my point of view, it's like, well, we are definitely missing a lot of our history, and yeah, it's not good. Yeah, we have a long ways to go.
And it's constantly being rewritten. I just shared an article in the chat where they discovered a pyramid in Indonesia that's now argued as the oldest ever. It's estimated to be built in 10,000 BC. And there's a line here which is interesting. I'll read it to you. It says, researchers have found a special technology hidden at the bottom layers of Gunung Padang. Magnetic anomalies in the area have been detected. It is speculated that a device similar to present-day hydroelectric power plant reactors might be present.
And there's pyramids all across the world on every single continent. We have less access to some than others, but in China there's 500 or some alone. Back in World War II, when some of the military documents reports that pilots wrote up said they actually flew over certain areas and saw fully intact pyramids that were bright and had their capstones on them and everything. And the more and more we look around, the older and older this gets, right? We have Göbekli Tepe now, we have Karahan Tepe. We're starting to see that 12,000, 13,000 years ago there was some sort of culture. Like we'll call them Atlantis because that's what the Egyptians called them. That was a protoculture to us that kind of had already harnessed electricity and circumnavigated the globe and colonized all the continents.
We got a guest here who wrote a pretty cool comment. It says, starting with Machu Picchu, going east through Sakase Human, Dogon country, North Africa, Giza, sacred sites in India, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and ending in Easter Island forms a 100,000-mile path around the Earth. Might it be the equator before the flood? Like that would maybe line up with some sort of magnetic field if that was all the way around the equator like that.
So I think this kind of takes us into the territory of pole shift, crustal displacement theory, and there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that the cataclysms that seem to be cyclical on this planet, they do have an aspect to them that kind of rearranges what we determine north and south, magnetic north and magnetic south. Even today, we're tracking the excursion of the north and south poles, and they're going in a direct direction. They used to kind of just bounce around like this, but then all of a sudden now they're just kind of moving. And they have been for years, and that speed of movement has been increasing. So, there's a growing body of evidence just from like geological records, studying, solar irradiance, things like micronovas, what sort of impact that could have on, a dynamo that is the Earth and the Sun, how that relates to, we were taught the Earth is a ball of, iron and nickel, and then you have your mantle, and then you have your crust. But now modern science is that doesn't exist at all. You have these things called low velocity zones where you have massive crustal displacement, you have huge magma plumes. We have an oscillating magnetic field in the core that changes every 7 years. So we're picking up more and more pieces to this puzzle. I think it's going to be an interesting next 10 years in that field.
Yeah, I read a book called The Adam and Eve Story,
Mhm.
and it talks about the Earth crust displacement. And the way he describes it is, if you think about an orange, and the skin of the orange comes loose and it moves around the orange, and that's a similar. I think it was Charles Hapgood who also kind of backed this up and says that from time to time you'll see this displacement theory, and it'll totally shift the whole shape of the Earth. And if you think about the land mass, or the land mass rotating on the Earth, what would that do for the oceans? Like, it would cause something like the Badlands. I know that Randall Carlson and those guys have an idea of comets coming, shattering this ice lake, and then that water flowing from the north across causing the Scablands and just causing these deep trenches of torrential water. But would not the oceans do the same thing if the entire world is spinning at however 1,000 miles an hour, and it all just going to spin through the water? You got these giant tidal waves that come over. And I think that the idea of cataclysms was something that was on the table until relatively the last 100 or 200 years. People thought, yeah, this is probably the way it works. And then all of a sudden we just came up with plate tectonics and these different kinds of ideas. But it would make sense, because if we look at the Piri-Reis map that was found, that shows Antarctica completely dry. It shows all the ports. It shows everything there. And there's probably not any way it would be dry if it was in the same position that it is in now. I wanted to speak one more point on that, is when we look at the north and south poles that are shifting, we know that when it's summertime in the north hemisphere, it's wintertime in the south hemisphere. And if the poles are shifting, wouldn't that also mean that the weather is shifting as well? And might that be something that we see happening with global warming? Since I've been growing up, it's like, oh, the summers look like they're getting hotter longer. The winters look like they're getting colder longer. But another way to say that is that the way we're calculating it is wrong. Like, wouldn't it also be fair to say that because the magnetic North Pole is shifting, so too are the temperatures of the months shifting? Like, and if the poles reversed, wouldn't it be wintertime in the North Hemisphere and summertime in the South Hemisphere? Maybe we're watching a slow rotation happening.
Well, yeah, yes and no. There's more to that equation.
Okay.
Now we're finding the sun has a very much dramatic impact on this. And when a lot of the science that's coming out about stars, for instance, we're finding that most solar or most stars that we observe, they have a cyclical nova event. And everything from micronova to nova, but now they're showing that we're just observing stars now that we can actually observe them long enough. The periods of these are short for some stars and longer for other stars. And you have to figure all of this is a huge electromagnetic system. So if you have a huge electromagnetic system, and then all of a sudden you have a massive influx of electromagnetic energy into this system, how's it going to affect the system? If I run a motor and then I pump a whole bunch of juice into it, the motor can only run so fast. Where does the other juice go? And so that's when you start to, back to crustal displacement theory, is it's now we're kind of showing that the electromagnetic boundary between the crust and the mantle, it actually, just because of all that moving and heat and magma, and then you have the crust on top of it, it's just like a massive dynamo. And so there's an electromagnetic kind of sphere that's inside of this. And then if all of a sudden that gets disturbed, you can have all of these continents, all this landmass, all this crust just free floating across of it. And to your point, that you would get massive flooding. And I think we're reaching a point in, of the whole cycle where, if that's true, within the next couple hundred years, maybe even, closer to now than later, we're going to see the effects of this in real time.
Wouldn't it be something if, like, that's why there's all this crisis? Like, the top scientists realize that, like, we're on the cusp of some sort of planetary cataclysm, and so they're like trying to like set up all like the food and all like the all the different countries right now are buying as much as they can and trying to hoard resources, because it's almost like a movie.
Well, to your, the Adam and Eve story, if I'm correct, I believe is originally classified
Yeah, yeah,
after
it
it was
was.
published, and then it was re-released with kind of a toned down version of it. And then crustal displacement theory got just lambasted via the media at the time. They got Einstein to shoot it down. They got everybody who was a prominent scientist to shoot it down after the declassification. So,
Here's in that book too. Like I scored like, for people that want to buy rare books, I would point you to like online thrift shops. There's a place called Thrift Books to get the hard copy of the Adam and Eve story, it's like $700. I bought it off Thrift Books for $6. And I'm like, dude, this can't be the right one. But sure enough, I'm like, dude, you got to be kidding me. So in that book too, another thing they talk about are star charts. And he claims that, he has the breakdown of the cyclical patterns where crustal displacement happens. And he talks about the age of Aquarius. And some of the evidence he gives, he goes, look at the the constellation Aquarius. It's a picture of a god dumping buckets of water on the planet. Like, why would someone come up like it's constellations have meaning behind them, and there may be multiple meanings, maybe different cultures and different tribes and different people ascribe different meanings to them. However, it seems pretty self-evident that one could look at that constellation and say, there is going to be a torrential amount of water. This could be a flood. Like, how do people come up with ideas to name constellations? Well, the age of Aquarius, like the age of the water bearer, like we get into language and translations again. And he says that in the age of Aquarius, you're going to see these huge floods. And wouldn't it make sense if a culture knew this happened? Like, let's say that Atlanteans, let's just pretend that cultures before us were wiser than us and they knew more than us. If you wanted to create a language to tell generations forever, wouldn't stars be the way to do that? Hey, how do we create a language that people will understand? Let's look at the stars. We know when this happens. It happens during the age of Aquarius. We understand astronomy. We know the cycle. So here comes the age of Aquarius. And think about how big astronomy used to be for the Egyptians, for anybody who wants to navigate the earth. We used to believe so much into the world of astronomy, and all of a sudden it was just wiped away like it was nonsense. But I think it makes a lot of sense if we are in the age of Aquarius. If the age of Aquarius shows a godlike creature dumping torrential amounts of water on us, and we have books that talk about floods, we have flood myths in every spiritual book there is, might it be something to take seriously?
this kind of blends into my hypothesis of things. To extend that thought experiment, imagine a world where your only existential threat was this cyclical disaster system. So let's say we're in Atlantis, who, we've been doing this for a long time and we've seen this come and go. And all of a sudden, we know that it's coming again, but we know that we're not going to make it this time. What kind of message do you leave behind? What do you teach people? What becomes the most important thing that you want people to look at? You want them to understand this system, this cycle. And, I don't think it's a coincidence that the signs of the zodiac are pretty replete throughout antiquity. Translations not becoming. And I think, in ancient times, they knew that the greatest existential threat to humanity on this planet was these disasters. Now, they might not be able to articulate them on where they came from, the science behind it, the electromagnetism, all that stuff, but they observed them. And I think if I was to want to impart something, if I'm at the end of the world, subjectively my world, and I know that everything's going to break, what sort of message would you try to send to the survivors? And I think that's the message you would send. And then if all of a sudden that's the message in all of the ancient cultures around the world, there's a consistent thread there. Again, it could just be an artifact of humanity, but I think it's a bit more than that.
It's weird. They say, we've all heard leaders say, if aliens came, it would be the one thing that unites us. But maybe this it's kind of the ultimate irony. The same thing that's going to kill us could be the same thing that unites us. Like if we all believed and we all were in mortal danger as a planet, like this flood was coming, we would probably have no choice but to work together as a world to solve the problem. I don't know if we could with greed and power and corruption, but it would give people the drive they need to do it. But what if it is the one that's too late? It's sad, but heartwarming at the same time.
Well, I think you're going to see that with climate change.
Yeah.
I mentioned before, climate change is a 10-round boxing match, and we're not even in a ring yet. So we have a long ways to go, and I just read a post here just recently that farmers took over the city hall in Belgium, I believe it was, and I'm going like, wow, this is not how we're going to go about doing climate change. And you have to realize, Pakistan has been on my mind because of the fact that they got a tremendous amount of rain over their western mountains, and displaced, I think, some like 30 million people or something like that, some large number of people. And they're like, well, what is happening? What is different? Why is this like the way that it is now? 500%, 1,000% more rain now than it was before. But then if you look to the west, then you'll find that you'll have all kinds of fires going in Spain, in Europe, in France, and and just to the west of the mountains there in Pakistan. And what's happening is that the carbon particulates then going over the mountain and coalesces the water vapor, and then this provides the moisture. But then you say, well, why Europe? Why is Europe in a drought? And then you go across to America and you say, well, wait a minute now, what's happening in America? So you have to look and you have to ask, what is different? What has changed? And so in America, what has changed is agricultural practices. So our agricultural practices, basically in the eastern Midwest portion, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, and say New York as an example, is the till to no till has decreased by 50% in, let's say, the last or more, probably in the last 15, 20 years. And it's the same thing with the Northeast. So you go to Maine, you go to Vermont, and you go to Upper Michigan as an example, and then you'll see ranges of till to no till that have decreased 30% or more. And the differences there is that the agricultural practices affect Europe, right? And because of what's happening with the release of carbon dioxide and carbon particulates from breaking fields open, affects Europe. So when Europe is affected, then Pakistan is affected. So we have to understand that Native American point of view is that everything is connected. You can't say, Pakistan cannot say, well, it's all our fault. It's all of this, or it's all of that, or it's runoff, or population increase, or whatever. Whatever we do, we affect other people elsewhere. And that is not something our politicians understand. And it is like today, it's like, oh my gosh, it's like, our politicians, they are not scientists, they are not farmers. Our politicians are mostly lawyers. And so, now we have this issue of like, well, wait a minute now. So what is the real problem here? And I'm suggesting that if you want to try to find solutions to problems, that we have to look at how we go about electing the people that represent us to be more fair, to be more honest, to be more representative of the people that they represent. In this case, maybe some farmers, and then maybe some scientists. And then maybe we would have better policy to be able to go about how we're going to do things in the world to be allow us to move through climate change without having thousands and thousands of people dying and millions of people being displaced. Because when you talk about that kind of thing, what you're talking about is suffering. And when you talk about suffering, that's a human thing. And that's what we don't want, because as humanity, we're not supposed to want suffering. So we have to look at a different way of doing things.
I agree we have to look at a different way of doing things for sure. And I agree that everything's all interconnected. My pushback on the carbon aspect is those particulates that are put up into the atmosphere are much more than just carbon. And it's a much more integrated system. And I think the sun plays a highly dramatic role in that. And I think there's a good body of evidence of science that's growing to support that. Now, when you talk about climate models from places like the IPCC, they don't account for things like solar forcing and instantaneous um, pro- instantaneous proton transference in this massive energetical system. But I would agree that without changing what we're doing, we're not going to find the proper solutions, and there will be suffering. Uh, I don't know if politicians are the way to go, though.
Well,
don't
that's
think.
true. And so, I was going to say, like in the Dust Bowl, when we had, like say the great floods of 1936, 1937,
Mhm.
our dust storms then were 75% silica.
Right.
And 20% metals. They were, 20% metals were made of iron and aluminum, and 5% of that was carbon, because carbon was depleted. The soil organic carbon was depleted. And if you go back further in the history of all the shipping and charting that all of our ships had created, you see a lot of if you look at the storms, the hurricanes coming off the Saharan desert, where you have the Sahara Desert and the Sub-Saharan tropics, where they were doing some minor agriculture. We're talking hundreds of years ago, but we can argue that those particulates that the hurricanes were being forced around to, where um, where the rain droplets or the vapor was coalescing around, could have been is sand, right? So a lot of that is silica,
Mhm.
as it was in the Dust Bowl, but also carbon. So and
Yeah.
both of those. So you just need a tiny piece of dust, and that's where
Right.
the rain coalesces around. So it doesn't have to be specifically carbon, but that's really where we're heading. Though I think is that carbon is ubiquitous. Of course, now sand is being more of a problem, but yeah, you're definitely right about the sand carbon issue.
Yeah. I think sadly, right, now it's turned into a political game, and not just a political game, but a money motivated game as well. All of this carbon capture, carbon credits, individual carbon consumption, all of that is a mechanism to extract value, uh, from one perspective from the populace. Uh, for instance, I think it was the World Economic Forum estimated that they would be able to extract $20 trillion of value over the next 30 years from carbon, basically creating a carbon economy. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't monitor these things and that we should be mindful of them and we should continue to study them. But I think when we start to get into solutions, it's important to take a look at the motivations of the people who are actually putting in the regulations, the policies, and pulling the strings on this, and what is their intention. To the point of electing more scientists and other things like that, that would be great, except when we go into these political spheres, it again becomes a pay to play game. Who's getting the funding to actually run these scientists? uh, you know it's counterintuitive to a lot of business models out there to not have a puppet as a political, kind of instrument. So I think we run into, you know, again, what's the pragmatic solution for this? And I don't know that it comes from the top down. I think it's a bottom up solution from the communal level, from regional levels, personally.
Well, that's where we're seeing, like in Belgium now, where the farmers are taking over breaking in. I'm not saying breaking in, but going marching down to City Hall and taking over, political arena. So then you have to say, where are we going? Are we heading towards the idea of chaos because we cannot agree on what is even, you know, climate change is an example. What is
Mhm.
it that we need to do as a people around the world globally to say, is there climate change or not? And if there is, what do we need to do as a global people to be able to find a solution to these problems? Because I can say that, farmers going to, to their city hall in taking over government as it was in Sri Lanka, right? Where they took over, took over the government and, because of, in this one case, and in actually both cases, I believe had to do with nitrogen policy. But the point being is that um, what is the political solution there? Is like, okay, well, if we did elect scientists, they're still puppets. Yes, I agree. So it's the filling of pockets. Then it is the is the special interests that have the grip on us. But the grip on us is actually hurting us. And so what we need to do is we need to figure out a better way of doing things. But is actually going down to the city hall and taking over the government the right way to do this? Is that how you get the message out in this manner? I have to disagree with the political arena in that particular case because you're talking about carbon climate change to the lens of nitrogen, and it doesn't work. So it's that the politics got it wrong, but then the farmer should say, hey, this is not exactly right, but I'm urging the farmers to come up with their own solution, their own plan, and then go to the government and say, look, here we are, farmers. This is what we think we can do. This is how we should do it, and maybe we got some give and take here. But as a political arena, then you can say, hey, okay, politicians, yes, we agree with that. Maybe we should add a couple more extra years here. Maybe we should reduce our nitrogen here. Maybe we should increase our carbon here, and then come to consensus and agreement because that's how we're going to get out of climate change. The way that we're heading into this about fighting each other is not going to work. We're going to go into chaos. We're going to have problems, and yeah, it's not good. So.
You know what, Dan? I think like this might be a good segue into the Terra Libre project. I think that I think Benjamin has an idea, a plan that starts locally and can be exported. And actually, I think Dan might have some pretty good insights too, coming from the Native American way of life, Benjamin, that could be helpful. But could you take a few moments to maybe bring Dan and maybe some of us up to speed on what, like, how would the Terra Libre project deal with something like this?
Right. Well, so the whole idea behind the Terra Libre project is to, basically create sustainable community, and thereby, by extension, create sustainable society. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to look at, these grand megacities and say that's not really sustainable. And by sustaining these cultural ways of life, we are sinking ourselves further into a hole, not only from, the perspective of, human assisted climate change, but also from the perspective of, just communication across borders. We're seeing that right now, right? There's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of build up to this. And so if you can create sustainable communities, and I think that's where it starts, and we have the technology to do this. We understand, nitrogen in the soil. We understand carbon capture in large swaths of land and in farmlands. We understand, regenerative agriculture. We have these concepts that we could employ. However, they're not employed because it's not a business model. It's not something to profit off of. And so the Terra Libre project essentially says, well, how do you merge those things? How do you put them together? And you put it together with kind of a corporate infrastructure, which is, backed by a blockchain technology, which enables one person, one vote, so that as it does expand, voices are heard, and you can actually bring these conversations to the table, like Dan's talking about. Because yeah, it would be nice for the farmers to come up with an idea, to have a plan to go to lobby the government, but it doesn't take much for the government to say no either. And it takes a lot less if you factor in that there's going to be financial interest in there to, motivate people in one direction or another. So I think, from my perspective, the solution is you start small and you get bigger and you build sustainably along the way. And there's a lot more details to it, but I haven't prepared my infographic. So I won't get too much into it because it gets heady.
Yeah, I think that
Well, I
it has to be. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
do a lot of work with Amazon Black Earth and Amazon Brown Earth, and that's typically, if you look at Amazon, they found a way to get us out of climate change, hundreds of years ago, with indigenous technology by carbon, basically a different way of slash and burn, but basically that's what it was. You can take soil of any type, at any altitude and in any climate, and you add carbon to it, and you're going to increase the yield because carbon in water is rich sugar, and that allows the cellulosic plants to grow. That's your regenerative agriculture. Then if you go back to the Dust Bowl and all that problems that happened in the Dust Bowl, which is a lot, the 1935, Soil Conservation Service came up with a whole prescription on how do we get out of climate change, with things like, planting trees, keeping farmers from breaking the fields open, for doing things like shelter belts, as an example, and those kinds of prescriptive methods. So it's there, and there's a lot more. I mean, I can't remember them all, but there was a lot. But the point being is that we have the technology to be able to get us out of climate change. We just need the political will and the ability to work together to do something spearheading some of the ideas of climate change to mitigate those. It could be planting trees. It could be crop covers. It could that are not broken up. CRP, conservation reserve programs, and a lot of good things happened out of the 1930s. With the Conservation Corps, and the WPA projects, and so there's a lot of good things that we can learn about history. But the point is I talk a lot about people to people about the Dust Bowl, and it's like a completely lost an understanding of what had happened and how we actually got out of the Dust Bowl. But the point being is that we can go and we like you said, we have the technology, but we just need the political will to be able to do those things, and we have to do them rather quickly, because I'm talking about some very serious stuff happening really quick in the world. So whatever has to happen, they talk about tipping points, like we're past the tipping point, and we are, I believe, past the tipping point. So what that says to us is that we have got to come together as a world rather quickly to be able to mitigate some of these things. And we, in America, we're split. We're 50-50. We're fractured right down the middle. Half of us believe in climate change, and the other half don't. And it's just like, how do you move forward when we're so fractured? It would be difficult to even imagine how to begin to do that. But the alternative is that if we don't do something, it's going to get worse. So we have to do something. But then the question is what? And so that's kind of where you're coming in.
Right. And then, so, how do you overcome the lack of political will / monetary will / societal will? And I think that is why you start small. You create a small duplicatable model that you can, export to different places in different regions, and you prove the system and you export the model, you prove it at larger scales, and it attracts like-minded people. I don't think we're going to come to consensus in the world before we're reaching a point of disaster. Back to how this conversation started, the differences in languages alone.
Yeah, when so much of this debate is people just talking past one another. The idea of climate change for a large corporation might be getting rid of giving away free straws. Like, hey, here's, we're supporting climate change by not giving away stuff anymore, and for some people it's, hey, the water is getting up to where our homes are, but there's so much there's no defining of terms when it comes to climate change. And the people that get the maddest at each other are people that are talking about two different things. And so we can never, why don't we have the best scientists in the world every Sunday getting together, debating this on television? Like, it could be done. We could define our terms. We could have people getting together and talking about it, but there's way too much money on both sides. And it seems to me the desired result is a fractured 50-50%. That way you can get done. The people with the most can get done what they want to get done, because nothing will ever get done, if that kind of makes sense.
Well, we go back to Belgium, right? So, is it the farmers that don't believe in climate change, or is it the fertilizer companies that are forcing the farmers to follow their lead? Because you see what I'm getting at? Where is the idea coming from? Who is carrying that flag? Is it the nitrogen fertilizer companies that are carrying that flag? That were maybe a farmer who would actually believe that, hey, we do have climate problems here. So we have to look at where the actual root of the problem is. And then if we get back to what we talked about before, George, is that, what do people understand? They understand money. What is the money issue regarding climate change? If you could take people who are rich, and what they like is they like more money, right? So we talked about this, is the idea is that if you take carbon and you make it a commodity, now what you've done is you set a standard, like you would gas, like you would fuel oil, like you would petroleum products, and diesel fuel and all that. If you had the ability to have a carbon commodity, which farmers know most, they know commodities the most. They have the equipment, they have the land, they can sink carbon, they can do the things that they need to do. Farmers, if they were in a carbon climate market, would be the winners behind this, and they would sink the carbon. And regardless of whether or not they believe in climate change, if they had the ability to say, if I put a ton of carbon in my field and I don't care about climate change, if that ton of carbon is in the field, what does it matter if there's climate change or not? The carbon is there. It's sunk there for hundreds of years. So that's how we have to go about this, is the way that everyone understands, and that we've leveled the playing field across the world. And we could do that if we set the same carbon capability as we do a gallon of gasoline. That's how we need to do that.
They've done it, right? There's something listed on the Chicago Stock Exchange, a carbon commodity. I saw it probably a month and a half ago, and we're
getting there.
Money, they're giving money to farmers depending on how big your land is, depending on the location, what sort of crops you're planting, things like that.
I think there's more to the story too. I've heard that in Belgium. I heard there's maybe part of the underlying condition is real estate acquisition. I heard that part of that government wants those people's land so that they can build on it. How much moving parts are we not seeing? Like,
right.
There could be an incredible, like, if those farmers have had that land, it's what it is? It's the same thing that happened at Bundy Ranch. Like, that guy has had that ranch. It's been in his family forever. And one day the government's like, hey, that's a park. We want that. And then he's like, you can't have this. This is my land. And the government, they wanted to put a Chinese solar farm wanted to go on the Bundy Ranch. So the government came in and said, this is state land. We're taking it, because they'd already sold it to China for the solar farm. So when they came to get it, the people stood up like, you're not taking this land. And they're like, yes, we are. And then you saw the standoff there. However, if you have laws that say climate change, now you can go in and take that land without having to do anything. Hey, here's legislation. This is for the planet. We're taking it. And I heard that's a lot of what's happening in Belgium. When you have countries that have very little land, and that land is worth so much money, what better way to get rid of the farmers than to tell them they're a huge problem and they're ruining the world and we need this land? If you can do it under the guise of climate change, you're going to do it. If that's the only way to get them off, you're going to do it. And if you can seize that land as the state, you're going to do it. And if you look at whether it's California or sometimes New York, you can see that being the centralized model, the same way that in the Chinese model, the state grabs land, a sort of militant, eminent domain for any reason, but mostly they say it's in order to create a better world, whatever. But that's the way some governments are going about seizing property, to take it away from people and take away the rights. And I don't think that's happening in every case, but I did hear that's happening in Belgium. And if that is the case, how much of climate change is it really? Is it real estate acquisition? Is it authoritarianism? Or is it that these people care about the planet?
Another
I-
lens on that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, another lens that you're talking about, I think it has to do with geolocation as well, because you're talking about dikes and those kinds of things, and they have a real threat to climate change when the sea level rise. And I think you're going to find that a lot in different countries. Bangladesh right now, I think in 2050 will lose 11% of its land base, and affect 18 million people. So the actual political base of these countries have a real concern about protecting their people. And we could see that in Bangladesh, right? I mean, well, in Bangladesh soon too, but like in Pakistan right now, in southern Pakistan, you can see what people in the northern Pakistan have to do to support the people in the south. So I think that there's more to the story, George, than just than eminent domain. I think there's, they have the people in power have a real concern about how they protect their people. And we see this in Pakistan, the administrator coming on and saying, hey, we're pleading for our people because, we're such disaster here, and I see this being an ongoing problem. This is not going to be a 2022 and we're done. We're going to talk about this in years to come. This is not going to be an ending thing. We're talking a long-term process here. We're affecting, millions of people, and a lot of people are going to die.
Another lens on that is the money perspective. All the people who have all the money, people like your World Economic Forum, they've come out and said the whole goal is you'll own nothing and like it. So at some level, you have to take that into account of all of this too. I mean, if people who are pulling most of the strings in the world are telling you that you're not going to own anything and you're going to like it, they're going to push for policies, regulations, eminent domain seizures, all sorts of things in order to facilitate that end goal.
I often wonder too, when it comes to climate change, like what one thing we don't ever talk about is like, look at how much has the Hoover Dam changed the climate. Like, look at the way the rivers flow through the world, and when you dam them up, the same way you change climate around the world. I got to think that prior to these gargantuan mega projects that use dam up rivers for electricity, like that fundamentally goes to Dan's point about changing the climate around the world. If a river flows from north to south and you dam it up so it flows more to the east, aren't you the same way you have the conveyor in the ocean? Aren't the rivers that go through the land conveyors of climate through the land? And how many structures and how many dams and how many times have we changed the course of rivers to suit our immediate environment without thinking about the consequences downstream?
All the time. But yeah, they are, to Dan's point earlier, it's all interconnected, if all of a sudden, millions of gallons of water are being distributed in an entirely different direction, what sort of downstream effects does that have? We could estimate those and we could guess on them, but we probably still don't even have the ability to really comprehend it. From just a scientific perspective, we could articulate a good chunk of it, I imagine. But still, to your point, what sort of damage are we doing that we're just completely unaware of, and in the name of what? And when you ask in the name of what, it usually, you get to a nationalist answer, and then you'll get to a monetary answer.
You're on mute, George.
Gentlemen, I can't tell you how much I love talking to you. I could talk for another 2 hours. However, my daughter told me, Dad, it's time to get off the internet. We got stuff to do. And so I know when my time is up, and I want to say thank you to every one of you for taking a few moments to have a candid conversation. And I have immense respect for all of your opinions. I wanted to kind of go around the horn and have everybody just say where they can be reached at, what they got coming up, and what they're excited about. So I'm going to start with you, Benjamin. What do you got going on? Where can they find you, and what are you excited about?
BenjaminCGeorge.com for all of my happenings and misadventures. I am excited for having more conversations like this. I know I'm doing a podcast. I know Rajesh is doing, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name, buddy. Sorry. He's doing a podcast. I hope, Dan, you get into the podcasting thing too. Kevin, I think if we can facilitate more conversations like this, it just brings awareness to all of the different nuances of these things, and the better off everybody is. So thanks for hosting, George.
Yeah, absolutely. Out of Paul, are you still there? I think Paul may have some problems with my discussion of the Bundy Ranch. Wanted to give him an opportunity to maybe say what he thinks about it. And of course, if he says nothing, I'll just assume that I'm 100% right and he backs down from the argument. I guess that's the facts, I guess. Kevin, where can people find you? What do you have coming up? And what are you excited about?
My website, kevinholt.me. My first book is on there. My course is on there. I think I mentioned last time, I am writing a second book. I'm towards the end of the second draft of that. It's about divorce and breakups and masculine, feminine relationship stuff. If anybody is interested in beta reading that for me and giving me feedback and opinions on how I can make it better, please do reach out. I would love for you to take a look at it, because I love critical feedback and people telling me where I'm shit and can be better at stuff. So yeah, reach out if you're interested in that. Going to Singapore in a few weeks. We're going to stay in the middle of the red light district, which I didn't know before we booked the trip. I heard it's pretty quiet now because of COVID, but yeah, it's going to be exciting. And thanks again, George, for doing this very difficult job of managing 4 people and keeping the discussion flowing.
It's easy, man. You guys are awesome. Dan, what do you got coming up, my friend? Where can people find you, and what are you excited about?
Okay, they can find me at United First Nations Planetary Defense, WordPress.com, UFNPD. We're starting to work on our constellation of computing satellites. So I'm really excited about that. Moving forward on FireSats, on a constellation of fire satellites as well. So that's something we're really trying to push because of the need of all the forest fires. Right now I'm in Hamilton and I can't even see the mountains. There's so much smoke. It's just ridiculous. So yeah, I'm working on getting us and Native Americans into space. So that's a big deal for us.
Awesome.
That's so awesome, man. I'm excited. I'm super. I think we're all thankful that you showed up today. Thanks for jumping in last minute like that. I know I kind of got to you a little bit late, but thank you for that. Paul has some microphone issues, so he says. He might be afraid of the debate. I'm not sure. But Paul, we love you, buddy. I wish your mic was better because I missed your voice, man. I missed you pushing back. I think everybody in the conversation is better when you're here and you can push back. And I hope that coming forward we can solve some of those mic problems. As far as me, I want to tell everybody right now, September 20th, Rick Strassman coming on the True Life podcast. We're going to get down and dirty into the world of psychedelics. Rick Strassman is also a fiction writer. Most people don't know that, but he wrote a really cool book called Joseph Levy Escapes Death. And it's laced with all kinds of psychedelic awesomeness. So I would recommend that anybody who thinks they know Rick Strassman, check out his fiction book because it's awesome. I'm trying to tell him he should do a series on it. And if anybody has any questions that they want to know about DMT, the spirit molecule, about the soul prophecy, and his newest book is called The Psychedelic Handbook. So go to his site, check it out. It's Rick Strassman. look him up. You can see him everywhere, and he'll be coming up on the 20th. So that's what I got going on. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for spending time on the True Life Podcast. From everybody here, we're stoked you're with us, and reach out to all of us. We'd all love to see you and talk to you. So that's what I got going on. Aloha, everybody. And thank you to everybody here. All right.
Yeah. Aloha.
Aloha.
Nice. Okay. And